The next thing that we are going to do here is to actually create a property for the PDO client class, protected DSN. If you have worked with PDO before, you will know that the DSN refers to the connection string or the data source name, which contains the driver, host, and then the name of the database, which we are attempting to connect to using PDO. And then the next thing that we want to do here is to actually create a constructor, because we need to actually pass in the credentials for our connection, like the host name, the database name, the user that is connecting, and the password of the user. We need to pass that through to the parent class, which is the abstract database class that we have here. If we come inside of the class, you can see right here that we actually have a constructor that requires all of these parameters. So any child class that extends this and want to actually make a connection to the database should provide all of these parameters. Public function underscore construct. And right now you can see that my text editor actually injected the parent constructor. So this is what you actually need to do. Inject the parent constructor and then pass in whatever value is being passed into the constructor of the PDO client class to the parent constructor. And this parent constructor does one simple job. It is going to assign these values to the properties that are defined inside of the database class, which are the properties that we have here: host, DB name, DB password, and DB user. And then the next thing that we want to do now is to actually create the DSN string. And if you want to make this a bit flexible, you can actually pass in a driver to the PDO constructor. So for example, you can say driver. And for the driver, we do not need to actually pass it through to the parent constructor. We only need to use it to formulate our DSN string. So this is more flexible because the user can now select that I want to actually use MySQL database, or I want to use Microsoft SQL database, or I want to use Postgres, or I want to use SQLite. Right here, and I'm going to say this DSN should be equal to, here I'm going to pass in the driver. So we're going to say driver, and then a column, and then the host keyword, followed by the equal sign, and then we are going to pass in whatever host the user is going to use. This is going to be host, or we can actually refer to this host, which will essentially give us the correct value, because on line 10, we have already passed in the property to the parent constructor. It has set it to the properties that are defined in the class, and then we can make use of them here. Then outside of here, a semicolon, followed by the keyword DB name. This should be equal to the name of the database that is being supplied. And here I can say this DB underscore name. And then the next thing that we need to do now is to provide our own implementation of the connect method. So I'm going to say this underscore handler equal to new PDO. To create a PDO instance, we need to actually supply the DSN, the username, and the password as the basic parameters. So we're going to say this DSN, and then this username, DB underscore user, and then this DB underscore password. And you should take note here that when you are building a reward application, you should actually wrap this in a try catch block and then catch a PDO exception, something like this. So this should be try, paste all of this here, and then catch a PDO exception. So that will be PDO exception, store it in a variable, and then you can die the message that is being returned if there's any exception. And then once we have made a connection and stored that inside of the property handler, if you remember when we created the select method inside of the abstract database class, we actually refer to this handler, which I told you is going to contain an instance of either the PDO class or the MySQLite class. And then now we can just return the entire object. Come in here and say return this. And then the last thing that we actually need to do here is to determine how we are going to fetch the record. Remember, the case study says we need to return the record as an std object. So inside of the get method, return this statement, fetch all, which is a PDO method, to get all of the data from the database. And then we can specify how we want to get the data. We want to get this as an object. And that's all we need to actually do here. We have now succeeded to create a PDO class that extends the abstract database class, providing a definition for the abstract methods, connect and get, and then utilizing the methods that are defined inside of the database class. So this is one of the use cases, because if we look at the database class, you can see here that we also have a method which is not abstract. This contains an implementation. And then we also have another method here, get connection, which also contains an implementation that can be shared by any class that actually extends the database class. So this is one use case where we should prefer using an abstract class over an interface, because if this is an interface, we cannot write any implementation. I cannot write the select method here with implementation. I can only provide a definition, as we did with the abstract connect method that we have here. So we can create a method, public function connect. It is going to be only the definition if we are using interfaces. If we want to provide some kind of functionality inside of the parent class, and then this allow the ability to actually instantiate the parent class, then we need to actually use abstract classes, because it doesn't make any sense to actually instantiate the database class. The database class is just a standalone class that provides functionality that should be implemented by client. So we are going to quickly test out the PDO client class that we created here inside of index to see if everything works as intended before we actually create the MySQLi class implementation. So right here, I am going to create a variable called PDO, should be equal to new PDO client, and then we are going to pass in all of the required parameters. The first one is going to be the driver. Let's say we want to connect to MySQL database. And then the next one is going to be the host. This will be localhost. And then the next one is going to be the database name. So I want to connect to a database called store. And then the next one is going to be the database username. It's also going to be store. And then the last parameter is going to be the database password. In this case, it's going to be secret. And then we can call the connect method. So this creates an instance of the PDO class and then call on the connect method. So right now, what we now have here is an instance of the PDO class, and then we can call the select method that is created inside of database, which is this one, and pass it a query. And then we can also call the get connection method, and we can call the get method. And then here, I'm just going to say products is equal to PDO select, and then pass it a query. So I'm going to say select from products. So I'm selecting all of the record from products, and then I'm going to call the get method. So this is going to define how I want to actually get the record. And if you look inside of the PDO client class, the get method that we define here says return the record to me as an object. So this is going to be an object of the std class. And then right here, we can do a var dump on products. And then let's do a reload on the browser. Right now, you can see that we actually get the products from the database as std class that we can actually loop through. Then instead of doing a var dump here, I'm going to create a for loop. For each products as a product, we just want to display the name of the product. So we're going to say var dump product name. So because this is an std object, we can now use the arrow syntax to actually refer to a specific property. So let's do a reload on the browser. You can see all of the different products that we have in the database displayed here. Okay, so now that we know that this is working, we are now going to create the MySQLi client implementation. Let's get into the code. MySQLi client, we need to extend database. And then to get rid of the error, we actually need to implement the abstract methods. Public function connect, public function get. And then we also need to create a constructor method, public function underscore construct. And for the connection method of the MySQLi client, we actually don't need to do anything here. We're just going to leave it the way it is. We need to now implement both the connect and the get method. So we're going to say this handler is going to be equal to a new instance of the MySQLi class. We're going to be using the object-oriented approach. So it's going to be equal to new MySQLi. And to make a connection, we need to actually provide some parameters. So the first one is going to be the host. That will be this host. And then the next one is going to be the username, followed by the password, and then the database name. This db underscore user, this db underscore password, and then finally we can give it the name of the database, this db underscore name. And as usual, you need to actually try to undo the error that might occur if the connection fails. Then after creating an instance of the MySQLi class and then storing it inside of this handler, we can then return the entire object. So we're going to say return this. And that's all we need to do for the connect method. We now move over to the get method. Remember that I told you that MySQLi doesn't have a way to actually return all of the records as object. We can actually get one record as an object and then pass it through a while loop and get the rest of the record. But like PDO, where we can just use the fetch all method and then specify that we want to fetch it as an object, MySQLi currently don't support that implementation. So we need to have a workaround. So it's very simple. It's not complicated. We are just going to say here, return JSON, the code, and then inside of the JSON, the code, we are going to pass in JSON encode. We are going to be encoding whatever we are getting from the statement. So let me just write it outside of here first so that you can actually understand what we're doing here. So what we want to do is say this statement, and then we want to call the MySQLi fetch underscore all method, fetch underscore all. And then we want to only get these as an associative array, because if we call the fetch underscore all method without specifying how we want to get it, it's going to return both associative arrays and also index-based arrays. So we're going to say we only need associative array. So MySQLi underscore assoc. So return this as an associative array. And normally we just end it like this, but because the case study says that we need to actually return this as an std class, so we cannot return an array. So the reason is because if we return an array here, we have actually broken the implementation. That means the way that we display the record inside of index, like here, when I display the record, I use the arrow syntax to refer to name. We can no longer do that. It means that we now need to do a different implementation for MySQLi client. And we don't want to do that. We want to do one implementation. No matter what API you're using to access the database, you can just plug in straight, provide your credentials, and then you are good to go. So let's come back again to MySQLi client class. And then I'm going to grab this and then put it inside of JSON encode. So right here, you see I have JSON decode, and then I have JSON encode. So this is a smart way for us to convert the array to a string, and then using JSON decode, we now decode the string, which is going to actually convert it to an std class. And that's all we need to actually do for the get method. So we can come back again to index, and then right here, instead of saying PDO client, I can just say MySQLi client. For MySQLi client, we don't need a driver. It's probably better to just duplicate this. And then for MySQLi client, we're going to remove the driver. And then right here, I can now change the PDO instance here to MySQLi to make the call. And that's all we need to do. If we do a reload now, we are going to get the exact same result. Nothing changes. You can see that we get the exact same result. Nothing actually changes. And if we do a var dump, see that this is an std class. Okay, so you can see all of the result here, and this is actually an std class. Before we wrap up this lecture, I'm going to show you some powerful things that we can actually do with the abstraction that we have just created. So let's say right now, I don't want to actually use the select method that we created inside of the database class, which is an abstract class, to query the database, which means I actually want to make a raw connection to the database. How can we do that? Remember that we have a get connection method inside of database.php, and this method returns the handler. And if you come inside of the connect method implementation, you can see that it actually set this handler property to be equal to the instance of whichever database connection API that the client is using. So inside of index, we can actually write raw query. So let's quickly illustrate that before we wrap up. Handler is going to be equal to MySQLi get connection. And then here I can say handler, or I can just say P for products is going to be equal to handler, and then call the query method, and then just write a different SQL here. Select from products where ID is equal to 6. And then here we can directly call the fetch method. So if we want to get everything, we call the fetch all method that we use inside of the MySQLi client. And then here I could say where ID is greater than 6. Then let's do a var dump on P. So when we reload, you see that we get 29 records. Let me just exit out of the script. You can see right now that we actually get 29 records. And the records that we are getting are those that the ID is greater than 6. This is a simple database wrapper that I've just created to illustrate the concept of abstract classes. And the key takeaway from here is use an abstract class when you know that the classes that will be extending the functionality of the abstract class, we do the same things in a different way and then do some things in a similar way. So they do some things in a similar way and do some things differently. In the example that we use, the way that PDO connects is different from the way that MySQLi connects. The way that PDO returns data to rows is different from the way that MySQLi returns data to rows. Essentially the same result, but being done in different ways. And then we have some functionality that they both share, like the query method that we saw. Both of them takes the query method that accepts an SQL statement. The only difference is the way that it returns the result. So this is just a clear example of where we can use an abstract class. And you can also argue that we can also use an interface for this, as I mentioned previously, but the only drawback when we use an interface will be that we cannot create any implementation inside of the interface. We still need to defer to a class that they're going to inherit those common functionalities from. So it is better that we actually just use an abstract class.